Yeah, so I'm continuing a project that some of you might have heard of, the International Saga Conference in Zurich in last summer. Those of you who were there, it starts to get to the new stuff at 4 minutes and 28 seconds in. I'm working with different material, though it's there is working with one of the þáttur. This time I'm mainly dealing with Vatnsdæla saga. So maternal space and child exposure is the subject matter I'm dealing with. The mother's powerful influence during early infancy has been described as maternal space by critics such as Patricia Cramer. Cramer notes that this space by definition excludes men and is associated with the acquisition of language. And such space also must be associated with the acquisition of abilities in familial and social integration. And I would add that the sagas are typically profoundly concerned with just these properties of familial and social integration. Of course, the idea of maternal space originates in the work from the 1980s of Kristeva, who has produced highly influential arguments concerning, quote, the unsettled and questionable subject of poetic language. This language, quote, maintains itself at the cost of reactivating the repressed, instinctual, maternal element, which is the never-finished, undefined production of a new space of significance. Pardon me. Sorry. I always choke on theory. An obvious situation, then, in which to examine the potential construction of maternal space would be the episodes when men try to co-opt such space. Cramer's article, for instance, is largely concerned with the sadist Walter's obsessive desire in Geoffrey Chaucer's Clerk's Tale to acquire his wife Griselda's maternal space, when she gives birth to the couple's first child, and again with the birth of the second. Allowing only time for Griselda to confirm her emotional attachment to these children, he orders that they be taken away from her, presumably to be murdered. A more promising opportunity, however, for examination of this kind of attempted co-optation occurs in the 8 or so narratives of child exposure that are extant in certain core texts of Old Icelandic. These works are promising generally because of the critical neglect that they still unaccountably endure. They promise even further because the social values that lead to the attempted co-optation in the sagas would seem to be more overt than those on view in Chaucer's Clerk's Tale. On the one hand, in child exposure episodes in the sagas, men typically place something in the infant's mouth to replace the mother's breast, and otherwise attempt to imitate and ritualize maternal space by, among other things, trying to secure the child's silence while it is exposed. On the other hand, these scenes frequently lead to female characters asserting their emotions, subverting the dominant social discourse with their own co-optations of language, and adopting covertly the typically male exercises of marking out of space. In short, quote, it is in language that the transgression of child abandonment occurs. There I'm enlisting Michel Foucault in my cause. He's not talking about child abandonment, but never mind that. There are examples of associations between language, landscape, and maternal spaces in the exposure narratives, particularly those related in Þorsteins' þáttur uxafóts, in Jónsvíkinga saga, and in the bishop's sagas, among other places, but the most mysterious and comprehensive example, to my mind, of the child exposure story in relation to a gender theme in its requisite saga is the story of Þorkel Krafla, or Thorkel Scratcher, in Vatnsdæla saga. Þorkel Krafla's exposure scene mixes conventional motifs with a narrative pattern that specifically suits the larger story arc of the saga in which it appears. One of the ideas in the saga that links an infant's place of exposure with later material is that this place substitutes for maternal space. I do not have time for a full discussion of the various traditions associated with the highly ritualistic settlement of the Vatn Valley as it is described in the saga, but I do now need to outline the connections between exposing a child on the Icelandic landscape and the account of a process of settlement in Iceland that begins this work, if only because in no other saga are instances of landscape descriptions so important. Ingimundr, Þorkel Krafla's ancestor and the leader of his family's settlement party, admires the landscape that the settlement party is progressing through and proposes, quote, greenness may turn out to be our lot. His prediction of fertility comes true almost immediately. Ingimundr's wife, Vigdis, a highly respected person in her own right, is one of the party. She gives birth to a girl, right out in the landscape, who is named Þorsteins. Ingimundur announces, "This place shall be called Þorsteins Holt," Þorsteins Forest. From here on then, Þorsteins' presence must infuse this landscape in a way that no other characters can, and when her grandson is exposed, this act amounts to a kind of parodic reenactment of this verse scene, I would argue. It takes place on Þorsteins' territory, the ancestral territory. Also, her physical need stops the motion of the settlement expedition, and she presumably marks the site with her blood. Appropriately then, inheritance through the female line is an important theme of Vatnsdæla saga and of Þorkel Krafler's life in particular. His great-uncles, the famous sons of Ingimundur, prosper, but eventually heroic status and the local leadership role pass to Þorkel, a product of a famous settling family's female line of descent. His exposure is thus distinguished from other examples by connecting this exposure to a highly resonant backstory. The ground for his attempted infanticide is prepared not only by the birth of Þorsteins, but also by the rediscovery of a silver amulet in a post hole for a temple that Ingimundur builds on the site of the new home. With such careful placement of landscape images in this text, it can be no accident that while the infant Þorkel lies exposed, and I supply now the exposure scene as number 1 on your handout. And while that is happening, then, just to quote it, Thorgrim at Karnsa had a child by his mistress who was called Nereid, and on the command of his wife, the child was put out to die. Now, all of his important male relations at the same time are meeting on the highway, right? As if they were emblematically on the path to progress, while the baby occupies a kind of no man's land. Þorstein, the boy's great uncle, announces, "Our kinsman Thorgrim has had his child left out to die on the instructions of his wife, and that is a wicked thing to do." Now, Þorstein has supposedly proposed a meeting of the sons of Ingimundur, not to deal with this wicked thing, but instead in order to discuss which one of the brothers seems to be the leading man. After a bout of deal-making, during which the life of the little boy kind of absurdly hangs fire, as if he represents the precarious state of the Ingimundur family's honor, as if they aren't going to rescue him, right? Until his descendants agree on the proper course. And then they jumped on their horses and rode to the place where they knew that the child was hidden. Thor's slave had found it at Karnsa. And a further distinguishing aspect of Thorkel's exposure is that he is abandoned with a cloth over his face. A detail that eventually gives this character his nickname, according to most critics and editors. The rescuers then saw that its face had been covered and that the child was pawing at it and was by then almost at the point of death. They took the child and hurried home to Thorir, and he brought up the boy, and he was duly called Thorkel Scratcher. The cloth that marks his face here is parallel to the conventional to folklore detail of a piece of bacon in the boy's mouth. This is meant to keep the baby from crying, and hence replaces the mother. The ability to cry out here becomes not only a matter of self-expression and honor, but a matter of life and death. Had the baby been satisfied with the cloth instead of his mother's breast, he presumably would not have been discovered. By scratching away at the cloth, the infant pantomimes the beginning of language acquisition. The child learns that a spoken utterance or sign indicates a certain object or individual, through recognizing the presence or the absence of that object or individual. Typically, of course, as psychological theory proposes, through the absence of the child's mother, for whom the child will call. Vatnsdæla saga thus serves as the first example of my argument of a remarkable pattern in these child exposure stories. First, a space where a child is exposed is clearly related to maternal space. Second, a description of language acquisition occurs alongside it, where issues of gender figure prominently in the description. In this case, to use psychoanalytical terms, the cloth over the child's mouth signifies an attempt to erase his identity. Signifies, to quote Foucault, that the father has never assumed the role of nomination. Where men co-opt childbirth by an act of naming, that is, an act of language, here an object in the child's mouth, among other things of course, attempts to stop the child's naming. The object is part of a desire to kill the child before he can be named by his mother, or by another person, maybe another woman, or name himself. The baby's attempted rejection of the cloth shows that, quote, the position of the signifier when a man has tried to co-opt maternal space has remained vacant, betraying an absence or lack that must be filled. I realize that Vatnsdæla saga seems to differ from other examples of child exposure by not dealing explicitly in the maternal spaces that I have described elsewhere, where a foster mother trains up a young child in language and knowledge. Yet I would contend that a strong theme of feminine language, displayed slightly, runs through the ensuing narrative of this work, so that in the end the saga follows the same pattern of the works that describe language acquisition more explicitly. In fact, there is a parallel undercurrent to heroic masculinity in the saga that emphasizes language abilities as the particular province of women, so that Vatnsdæla saga actually goes further than most other Norse compositions in its explicit feminization of its hero, an enactment of maternal space. Þorkel is fostered and grows up. He is invited to a wedding feast where he encounters Gleðir, a particularly insulting antagonist, and helps to capture, kill, and prepare a piglet for the wedding feast. Obviously, as one of the fruits of the natural world, this piglet is reminiscent of the first age for fertility of the Vatn Valley when the settlement party first encountered their new land. And the food at the wedding feast is obviously heavy with sacrificial associations. Yet, when Gleðir needles Þorkel, he does so using a multi-layered image that includes a vivid reminder of the protagonist's exposure scene. So, 2 of these insults are given to you as number 2 on your handout. And again, to quote the translation, he had killed a piglet which only the previous night drunk from the teat and lain beside the boar, because he felt cold like any other bitch. And this is what Gleðir is saying directly to Þorkel. But of course, this is extremely complicated insult, right? Working on a number of levels. Because the piglet is Þorkel himself as a newborn, seeking food and warmth from the body of his mother. The insult repictures maternal space. Of course, the innuendo ranks as one of the sexually based insults in Old Icelandic that is meant to escalate a verbal conflict into a physical one. Gleðir means to shame Þorkel by casting him in a lower class role and implying his sexuality as non-normative. When Gleðir repeats his insults, he explicitly feminizes Þorkel even more directly. Yet, in one sense, the content of Gleðir's needling is correct, because subsequent events make plain that communication between a man and a woman on a mutually beneficial plane is a particular ability of Þorkel. He is trained in women's language and lore, unlike the other characters that surround him, as events just after the insults openly dramatize. Now, to begin that sort of narrative part, I know you'll be shocked and stunned. It certainly shocked me to learn that at the same wedding feast, Þorkel strikes Gleðir a fatal blow in the head with an axe, right? I think we're all rather expecting that. And seeking to flee, he looks over to where women sat, and they're donning their headdresses. The donning of headgear could not be a more performative action indicating gender, a point the saga emphasizes with repetitive phrasing concerning what makes a space women's space. Þorkel then ran to where Hild was, and Hildur is a member of the household at the feast who corresponds to Þorkel in maintaining an ambiguous class role. Like him, she has helped to make the wedding preparations. And now, she told him to go into the passage right by where she was, and in this way he made his escape. Significantly, and despite the narrative mentioning of women's space 3 times, while Þorkel negotiates his way through it, no specifics about precisely what makes the space feminine versus masculine ever appear. This space is just where the women are, as if assignations of space by gender were arbitrary, contingent, and artificial. Þorkel's next and only other described meeting with Hildur demonstrates even further that gender assignation is merely the assertion of an empty sign when one chooses to set aside the attitudes relied upon by the likes of Gleðir. When Þorkel's men approach the booth at a Vatnsdæla assembly in order to take revenge, this is on Hermundur, who is Hildur's son now, for killing a family member. So Þorkel, of course, is kind of in charge now of his family group, right? Hilda reminds him of their previous encounter and suggests that Þorkel would not wish to kill her son before her eyes. Now, Þorkel's reply seems typically hypermasculine and revenge-minded. More things have now come to pass than we then expected. Leave the booth now, because if you do so, you will then not see your son killed before your eyes, he says. But instead of a killing, a sophisticated and intensely situational communication between Hilda and Þorkel occurs, so that just as at the wedding feast, a life is saved due to a mistake of gender identification. She now understood, in fact, that what he said was meant to help Hermundur, and this ruse seemed to her both quick-witted and brave. She then took off her headdress and decked Hermundur in it. So I include this excerpt as number 3 on your handout, so you can see for yourself how a covert understanding between Hilda and Þorkel, a kind of special language, is the only way the resulting escape can work. In addition, the iconography of this scene underlines the idea of an intuitive relationship between the two genders in the minds of Hilda and Þorkel. Pardon me, as these two characters shift places in the booth, almost as if they were engaging in a kind of dance. And all of this when the saga indicates no romantic relationship between these two characters whatsoever. Another powerful example of Þorkel's rare abilities to understand and employ the more typically maligned abilities of women is his winning of a lawsuit through the help of Þórdis Spákona, the prophetess. In fact, this contest in the law courts reads as a parallel case to the escape episode, with extraordinarily empathetic and communicative abilities with women now interpreted as magical abilities. His adversary in the suit boasts the reluctant, though enviable, patronage of Guðmundur Ríki. However, Þórdis, too, prophetess, is highly respected. She is one of the very few women who maintains a booth at the district assembly, where she meets with Þorkel and agrees to take up his cause. A settlement plan that she promotes brings no progress in the matter. Guðmundur insists that Þorkel be outlawed for the unavenged killing of a family member. As often happens in other sagas, then a wise character hatches a plot to try to circumvent or halt the action of a lawsuit. And Þórdis's plans calls for, and this is number 4 in your handout, calls for Þorkel to go now in my black cloak and carry in your hand the staff which is called Högna. And then she asks, she follows this up with a question, would you dare to go among Guðmundur's men dressed in this way? In other words, I think the saga is being absolutely explicit here. She openly challenges Þorkel to dress as a woman and adopt a female role. In one respect, Þórdis's cloak picks up on an established theme of the saga. Þorkel has already encountered women's clothing when he passes through the space where women are putting on their headdresses. Yet, in another respect and circumstances, as Jenny Jochens notes, cross-dressing is one of the most condemned actions that a typical saga character can take. Þorkel's resort to women's dress under Þórdis's direction is an example of a specific charm that occurs in several sagas, and I've identified this elsewhere and talked about it, so I'm not going to go much further on that, except to mention that her magic takes effect. Þorkel came among Guðmundur's men, and no one saw him. The working of the charm depends on the presumption, traditional and thoroughly recorded in Old Icelandic, that women can pass through social structures of all kinds, completely without notice, due to assumptions that they are servile and hence beneath notice. As in other cases of the mistake of gender charm, Vatnsdæla saga seems to be criticizing the ignoring of women and the taking of them for granted by men, because such dismissive treatment and attitudes allow unsuspected infiltration of an adversary's spaces through disguise. Þorkel duly gains access to his enemy's space, strikes Guðmundur on the left cheek 3 times with the staff, and exits, all apparently without anyone noticing. The marking of Guðmundur's face renders him parallel to Þorkel in his role as an infant who has been abandoned and has a wrinkled cloth on his face. More generally, touching of the face, besides invasion of personal space and hence humiliation for the recipient, is reminiscent of facial expression, the action of the face during speech, and the intimate relations between family members, particularly between child and mother, right? Mothers constantly touching their children's faces. The charm seems to be attached to Þórdis's cloak specifically while Þorkel is wearing it, which recalls the clothing pattern of the saga so far, the cloth over Thorkel's face and the clothing associated with Hildur. The result of Þorsteins' intervention is that Guðmundur loses his memory and hence the lawsuit. Some measure of his power seems to transfer to Þorkel through the working of the charm, which continues only so long as it is useful. Þorsteins sends Þorkel to Guðmundur a second time in disguise, whereupon the spell is broken, though the interloper again leaves Guðmundur's booth without being noticed. Later, Guðmundur specifies the effect of Þorsteins' charm. He says, "I could not think of a single word to say, and therefore I dried up." In terms of the saga's theme, it is important that a woman, in terms of the saga's language theme, it is important that a woman, through means of a cross-dressing man, silences a renowned chieftain. Surely part of Thorkel's success may be attributed to his acquisition of magical abilities and a capacity for gender ambiguities from Þorsteins. He learns these abilities as an adult, but they are crucial to his heroic style success. After the lawsuit, he now marries, becomes an extensive landowner, a respected arbiter of disputes, head of the Vatnsdæla clan, and the Gothi. He just has that typical success pattern, right, for the male hero. So, a survey of these episodes then suggests that maternal space, I guess I should flesh that out just a bit. Survey of these episodes, there are other examples in other sagas that I'm not going to deal with today, but I'd be happy to answer questions. Suggests that maternal space in the sagas reasserts itself during instances of child exposure, with unusual depictions of heightened expression by certain female characters in these works, and also examples of highly individual language production. Vatnsdæla saga thus fits into a pattern discernible in several old Icelandic works, for instance, Þorsteins' þáttur uxafóts, where the titular hero re-encounters maternal space during his attempt to cleanse a district of a family of trolls, and where maternal space and child exposure are directly connected by the narrator. In Floamanna saga, where a trip to Greenland results in a forestalled exposure, but nevertheless connects co-opted maternal space with the landscape in a particularly direct fashion. In Jónsviking saga, where an exposure leads to maternal space being connected to the interpretation of dreams, according to biblical tradition. Maternal space thus opens a window into the agency of women, even in their highly circumscribed roles as mothers in the Sagas of Icelanders, though this opening is limited and the aperture is often difficult to perceive. Nevertheless, the idea of a language exclusive to women is perceivable, while old Icelandic works vary in a virtuosic fashion in their treatment of this language theme. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now there are time for questions.
Thank you very much. That was quite fascinating. I was wondering, you mentioned, for example, like Thorkel's ability to then, when he does that cross-dressing scene, that's normally so negative in the sagas. But he gets away with it, him having grown up as one of these exposed children. Are there other examples of exposed children who grow up to do these like gender norm bending or challenging activities?
Yeah, absolutely. The one that occurs to me off the top of my head is again Þorsteins' þáttur uxafóts, which is also forward in my mind because I talked about it fairly recently too. But that one, I'll talk about the troll stuff, right? He encounters this troll family, right? And there are images of childbirth there, and of course, as is typical, he cleanses the area, right? But just before he does, he meets up with one of the younger troll girls, and all of a sudden it's like he's looking in a mirror, right? They've both gone to collect water at the lake, and that's how they meet up. And only then does he go chasing after her and finds the troll hall, which is kind of a classic image, right? And goes in there, and there's an older troll woman covered in a bloody silk shift, right? This kind of thing. Now he kills her, he thinks. She comes back alive as one of these revenant figures. And she is going to bite his throat in two when a miraculous beam of light comes down. We're in the realm of realistic fiction, as I'm sure you've noticed. And all of a sudden her power drains away, right? So I'm thinking her female power at that moment in some ways kind of drains away into him, as is often the case when you kill your enemy, right? You take on some of their attributes. And then lo and behold, the þáttur mentions specifically, people are unsure if some of the vomit is what it's described as, right? From the troll woman got inside of him, right? And thus that's part of his makeup now. Or whether it was his exposure that caused this, right? So they're kind of using the exposure as a theme going along through the story, and it's, you could even say, ingesting female attributes. I would put it that way. Sorry, there's more to it than that, but that's the best example.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Questions or comments? Yes?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I've just been trying to find the saga I'm thinking of, but I can't find it.
Yeah.
And you may know it, but if you don't, then my question's going to be pointless. And it's one which maybe it's Vatnsdæla, it's Frostbride, maybe it's another one of the Icelandic saga, but it's where, and it's around the I suppose feminine space being co-opted, but is it really the scene which you may recall, and if you don't, then hopefully someone else will be able to help me out with this question, is where the main character, the wife of his child, dies, and he uses a knife to cut milk into it.
That's Flowman Saga, yes.
Yeah, Flowman Saga, that's right,
yes.
yeah. And I wonder if you'd just like to share a few thoughts on the gender structure in that, if whatever else comes from that, yeah.
Yeah, I'll try. I'm sort of working on that one, because that one is very different, right? I describe that one as kind of a displaced exposure story, because what happens is they've made the trip to Greenland, right? Mm-hmm. And as is often the case, a wife comes along who's pregnant, and then once there, as the other stories show, the people start to die, right? And there's a description of a kind of pestilence, and the hero's wife dies, and he hears a gurgling sound over in the corner when he arrives back at his home. And he realizes that the child is Thorfinn is the child's name, I'm sorry, I forget the hero's name for the moment, is suckling at his mother's breast, and of course she's dead now. Mm. And he realizes the situation that he's in, and speaks to his companion and says, I'm afraid the child will have to be killed, right? So it would be similar to exposure, where for economic reasons, the fact that there are too many mouths to feed, and in this particular case, there's presumably no nursing woman to feed the child in its infancy, right? That the child is going to have to be killed. But then he decides, no, I'm not going to do that, and he slashes his nipples open. And at first blood comes out. Then I think the description is something in water, maybe, in which case it becomes very Christological, right? And then milk. So it's a miracle. And in some ways you can see this as a Christian miracle too, right? It's certainly picking up on a lot of different kind of Christian imagery. And the child, of course, starts to take the milk and starts to grow up, and is therefore a kind of miraculous child. But the story doesn't end happily, right? They're on board ship, and a wave takes the child right out of his father's lap. And then he says, well, that's the lot. I'm not going to remember it properly, but so is one's lot in life sometimes. The sea can take away or it can give. And then, of course, needless to say, there's another miracle, and the next wave puts the child back. And then the boy starts to spit blood and dies. And it's very sad, right? So what to make of this in terms of gender is a man tries to take on female attributes, right? But by it being a kind of miracle story, we're already in the realm of magic again. And then I think it's significant in this case that it is A, very, very unusual, and B, doesn't work. There is no hero that grows up out of that, right? The way there typically is with the other exposure stories, where the character's exposed, and then they grow up to have a highly famous existence, right? It's part of the inglorious youth motif when they get over their inglorious youth. In this case, it's kind of a negative of that. What may be happening is some of the stuff we've heard earlier on what's happening in Greenland and Vinland, right? The old stories aren't working anymore. Things are kind of falling apart. Might be a way of taking that. But I hope that helps.
That's good, thanks.
Yeah, again, I'm still working on that.
Yeah.
Yes, I think we have to finish.
Yeah, right.
Wait for the next speakers.
Absolutely.
Once again.
Yeah.